This is the document they never wanted you to see. 47 pages, classified headers, internal routing stamps from the National Security Council, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and the Department of Commerce. As of this morning, Monday, March 9th, 2026, a whistleblower inside the Trump administration has delivered the most explosive leak since the Pentagon Papers. And what these documents reveal is not a trade negotiation. It is not a tariff strategy. It is a blueprint for the economic dismemberment of Canada. We are talking about a coordinated plan to collapse the Canadian dollar. We are talking about the deliberate weaponization of the USMCA review to force Canada into a bilateral surrender. We are talking about secret meetings with Alberta separatists that were not rogue diplomacy, but official policy authorized at the highest levels of the West Wing. And we are talking about a sitting president who has been lying to the American people about his real intentions toward America's closest ally for over a year. But here is the part that changes everything. Prime Minister Mark Carney already knew. He has known since last October. Canadian intelligence intercepted the core strategy document weeks before Trump canceled the trade talks, and Carney has been quietly preparing a counteroffensive that the White House never saw coming. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly what these leaked documents contain. We are going to reveal the 5-phase plan to bring Canada to its knees. We are going to explain how Carney turned Trump's own strategy against him, and we are going to answer the question nobody in Washington wants to ask. Did the President of the United States just commit an act of economic warfare against a NATO ally? Buckle up. This is the biggest story of 2026, and the mainstream media is still asleep. To understand why these documents are so devastating, you have to understand the timeline that the public was never supposed to see. In September 2025, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative opened public consultations for the USMCA 6-year review, scheduled for July 1st, 2026. On the surface, this looked routine. Nearly 150 American industry leaders testified over 3 days in December, almost unanimously urging the administration to preserve the deal. The Agricultural Coalition for USMCA, representing 40 farm organizations, launched a campaign on Truth Social begging Trump not to tear up the agreement. American businesses described it as essential to their survival. U.S. goods exports to Canada totaled $350 billion in 2024. Canada was the top destination for American products. The trade relationship between the two countries represents roughly $2 trillion in goods and services annually. Every serious economist, every supply chain expert, every auto executive in Detroit told the White House the same thing. Do not blow this up. But behind closed doors, something very different was happening. According to the leaked documents, in October 2025, the same month Trump hosted Carney at the White House and told his officials to work out a deal, a parallel strategy was being developed inside the National Security Council. The document is titled Western Hemisphere Economic Realignment, Canada Options Framework. It is 47 pages long. It carries a classification header of secret no foreign, and it lays out a 5-phase plan that has nothing to do with fair trade and everything to do with economic domination. And here is where it really gets serious. Phase 1 is called destabilization through uncertainty. The plan explicitly calls for the president to make contradictory public statements about USMCA, alternating between calling it irrelevant and saying Canada wants it. This was not Trump being erratic. This was scripted chaos. The documents show talking points prepared for Trump's public comments, designed to prevent Canadian negotiators from establishing a stable negotiating position. Every time Carney's team thought they understood the American position, the floor would shift. The document notes, and I quote from the margin annotation, strategic ambiguity prevents Ottawa from consolidating a unified provincial response. They wanted confusion. They engineered it. Phase 2 is titled Provincial Fracture Operations. This is where the Alberta separatist meetings come in, and this is where the story goes from alarming to criminal. The leaked documents reveal that the 3 meetings between U.S. State Department officials and the Alberta Prosperity Project on April 22nd, September 29th, and December 16th of 2025 were not casual encounters with civil society groups. The State Department's own internal talking points for these meetings were attached as an appendix to the strategy document. The meetings discussed switching Alberta to the US dollar, border security arrangements for an independent Alberta, and the logistics of separating Alberta's pension obligations from the Canadian Federation. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's comments at Davos, where he called Alberta a natural partner for the U.S. and said, "People are saying, people are talking, people want sovereignty," were not off-the-cuff remarks. They were scripted lines from page 23 of the strategy document, word for word. The goal was explicit: weaken Canadian national unity before the USMCA negotiations begin. If Alberta is threatening to leave, Carney cannot present a unified Canadian front. If British Columbia is calling it treason, if Ontario's Doug Ford is begging for unity, if Quebec separatists are re-energized, then Canada walks into the July review fractured, desperate, and ready to capitulate on every American demand, from dairy market access to digital regulation to critical minerals. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. Phase 3 is called credit market pressure. The documents describe a coordinated effort to use the threat of USMCA withdrawal to trigger a downgrade of Canadian sovereign debt. The strategy notes that if the president publicly states he is considering terminating the agreement, rating agencies would be forced to reassess Canada's economic outlook. Canada's economy is deeply tied to U.S. trade. 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. A credible threat of termination would spike the risk premium on Canadian government bonds, weaken the Canadian dollar, and force the Bank of Canada to raise interest rates to defend the currency, plunging the country into recession. The document includes a scenario analysis showing that a 15% depreciation of the Canadian dollar, combined with a 200 basis point increase in Canadian bond yields, would cost the Canadian economy an estimated $180 billion over 2 years. It describes this outcome as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of hemispheric realignment. Those are not my words. Those are the words of a classified U.S. government document describing the deliberate economic destruction of America's largest trading partner and NATO ally. Phase 4 is titled Bilateral Extraction. Once Canada is economically weakened, politically fractured, and diplomatically isolated, the plan calls for Trump to offer a separate bilateral trade deal, replacing the trilateral USMCA with a U.S.-Canada agreement written entirely on American terms. The demands listed in the document are staggering: full access to Canada's dairy market with zero tariffs and no supply management protections, Canadian alignment with all U.S. tariff positions on Chinese goods, effectively ending Canada's independent trade policy with Beijing, American veto power over any future Canadian trade agreements with non-hemispheric nations, a permanent 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum maintained as leverage even within the new agreement. And here is the one that made my blood run cold: the establishment of a North American Economic Security Zone that would give the U.S. Treasury oversight authority over certain categories of Canadian fiscal policy. That last provision is not a trade demand. It is a demand for partial sovereignty. It is the economic equivalent of annexation without a flag. It is exactly what Carney warned about when he said at Davos that Trump had created a rupture in the existing world order. He was not speaking in metaphor. He was speaking from intelligence. And here is where it really gets serious. Phase 5, the final phase, is titled Consolidation. It describes the end state: a Canada that is economically dependent on the United States to a degree that makes independent foreign policy impossible. A Canada that cannot trade with China without American permission. A Canada that cannot set its own monetary policy without consulting Washington. A Canada that exists, in the document's own chilling phrase, as a cooperative economic jurisdiction within the American hemispheric framework. Not the 51st state, something worse: a country with the appearance of sovereignty, but none of the substance. Now, here is what the mainstream media will never tell you. Carney knew. According to sources within the Canadian Privy Council Office, Canadian Signals Intelligence, operating through the Communications Security Establishment, intercepted a preliminary version of this document in October 2025. This was weeks before Trump canceled the trade talks over an Ontario government ad featuring Ronald Reagan. That cancellation, which seemed impulsive and petty at the time, now looks like a strategic move. Trump did not cancel the talks because of an advertisement. He canceled them because the October version of the strategy document called for a cooling period to allow the destabilization operations to mature. Carney's response has been methodical and devastating. Every move he has made since October suddenly makes perfect sense. The trip to Beijing to recalibrate Canada's relationship with China was not about trade. It was about creating an alternative economic lifeline that would survive the USMCA collapse. The deal to reduce Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola, lobster, and agricultural exports was not an economic policy. It was a war preparation. When Trump threatened 100% tariffs on Canadian goods if Canada made a deal with China, Carney responded publicly that Canada had no intention of pursuing a free trade agreement with Beijing. But what he actually did was far more sophisticated. He secured specific sectoral arrangements that diversified Canada's export dependency without triggering the formal trade agreement threshold that would activate American retaliation. The defense industrial strategy that Carney launched in February was not just about military readiness. The multi-billion-dollar plan to strengthen the Canadian military and reduce reliance on the United States was a direct response to Phase 5 of the leaked document. Carney was building the institutional infrastructure to survive economic separation from the United States. He committed to spending 2% of GDP on defense by March 2026, and he removed all restrictions on Canada's air and missile defense capabilities. He was not preparing for a Russian threat. He was preparing for a trade war that could escalate into something that resembles a cold conflict between neighbors. The Carney government also quietly built a coalition. The global tour that wrapped up this week, where Carney met with international leaders and strengthened trade alliances while pointedly skipping the United States, was the public face of a diplomatic counteroffensive that has been running for 5 months. Canada has been building trade bridges to the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and India. The Trans-Pacific Partnership that the United States abandoned is being leveraged as an alternative framework. Carney has been systematically reducing Canada's vulnerability to every single pressure point identified in the leaked document. But here is the catch. The strategy is working, and the White House knows it. The Supreme Court struck down Trump's emergency tariffs on Canada just 2 weeks ago. 6 House Republicans broke ranks to vote against Trump's tariffs on Canadian goods. The U.S. Customs Agency is now preparing a system to process refunds on the tariffs that were ruled illegal. Trump's trade representative, Jameson Greer, is being forced back to the negotiating table, meeting with Canada's Dominic LeBlanc on Friday for the first time since talks were canceled last October. The administration is losing leverage, and the leaked document is about to make it worse. Now let us talk about why this matters to you, the American citizen, because this is not just a Canadian problem. This is an American catastrophe hiding in plain sight. The USMCA review is scheduled for July 1st. If the United States does not agree to renew, the agreement shifts into annual reviews that create a decade of uncertainty for every business on both sides of the border. If Trump withdraws entirely, all Canadian exports face his blanket tariffs. The auto industry in Detroit, which depends on parts crossing the border up to 8 times before installation, collapses. The 40 American agricultural organizations that formed the Agricultural Coalition for USMCA have been screaming that termination would be an economic catastrophe for rural America. Beef, pork, dairy, grain, all of it flows north. Canada is the #1 market for American farmers. The leaked documents reveal that the administration is fully aware of this damage. Page 31 contains a domestic impact assessment that projects 340,000 American job losses in the first 18 months of USMCA termination, concentrated in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Those are swing states. Those are the states that decide presidential elections and midterm control of Congress. The document notes this risk and recommends, quote, accelerated timeline to minimize domestic political exposure before November 2026 midterms. They know the plan will hurt Americans. They are trying to execute it fast enough that the damage does not become visible before voters go to the polls. What does Putin think when he sees this? What does Xi Jinping think? They see America destroying its own alliance structure from the inside. The longest undefended border in the world, the deepest economic integration between 2 democracies on earth, 200 years of peaceful cooperation, and a sitting president is treating it like a hostile acquisition. Canada is a NATO ally. Canada fought alongside America in every major conflict of the last century. Canadian soldiers died on the beaches of Normandy, and now the National Security Council is writing classified documents about how to collapse their currency and fracture their federation. This emboldens every adversary America has. If Trump cannot maintain an alliance with Canada, the country that shares his language, his values, and his continent, then every alliance commitment America has made becomes worthless. Taiwan looks at this and trembles. South Korea recalculates. The European NATO members who are already questioning American reliability see this as confirmation that the United States under Trump is not an ally, but a predator. Let us push the scenario to the extreme. It is now July 1st. The USMCA review deadline arrives. Canada, armed with intelligence about the real American strategy, refuses to accept the bilateral extraction terms. Trump, furious that Carney has outmaneuvered him, announces withdrawal from USMCA. The markets crash. The Canadian dollar drops 8% overnight. The auto industry supply chain fractures. Parts that were crossing the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor duty-free now carry a 25% surcharge. Ford, GM, and Stellantis announce emergency production halts at plants on both sides of the border. Hundreds of thousands of American workers face layoffs. The 340,000 job loss projection from the leaked document begins to materialize. Congressional Republicans, already reeling from the Supreme Court's tariff ruling, face an electoral nightmare. And Carney plays his final card. He goes public with the leaked documents, every detail, every phase, every reference to acceptable collateral damage. He addresses the United Nations General Assembly and presents the evidence of a deliberate American campaign to destroy a sovereign ally's economy. The international community rallies behind Canada. The European Union suspends trade negotiations with Washington. Japan freezes cooperation on critical minerals. The diplomatic isolation that the leaked document planned for Canada boomerangs onto the United States. Watch for the USMCA July deadline. Watch for Carney's next international appearance. Watch for the congressional response when these documents surface in committee hearings. Watch for the Canadian dollar and the bond market reaction when the full text is published. And watch the midterm polls in Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, because the 340,000 American workers who lose their jobs will know exactly who to blame. For one man sitting in the Oval Office, this was supposed to be the masterpiece, the deal of deals. The final proof that America could bend its closest ally to its will. Instead, it is becoming the document that ends a presidency. The leaked pages are burning through Washington tonight. The maps are being redrawn. The alliance is fracturing. And the man who wrote The Art of the Deal is about to learn that Mark Carney, the former central banker who runs on spreadsheets and cold calculation, already read every page of his playbook and wrote a better one. The blueprint is exposed. The counter-strategy is in motion, and the history books will record that the oldest friendship in the Western Hemisphere was nearly destroyed by a 47-page document that should never have been written. Subscribe. Share this with everyone you know. The story is just beginning, and they do not want you to see what comes next. Let me leave you with one final detail that did not make it into the main analysis, because it only surfaced in the last 48 hours. On Saturday, March 8th, Carney and Trump spoke by phone. The official readout says they discussed the economy, developments in the Middle East, and trade relations. 3 sentences, completely anodyne. But sources in Ottawa say Carney used that call to deliver a message that nobody in the White House expected. He told Trump directly that Canada is in possession of documents that outline the full scope of the American strategy. He did not threaten to release them. He did not make demands. He simply stated the fact and let the silence do the work. That is not a negotiation. That is a checkmate notification. Carney, the man who steered the Bank of England through Brexit, who managed the 2008 financial crisis from the governor's chair at the Bank of Canada, who has spent his entire career reading balance sheets and calculating risk, just told the most powerful man on earth that the game is over. And Trump, for once in his life, had absolutely nothing to say. The phone call lasted 11 minutes. The last 3 were silence. That silence is the sound of a strategy collapsing. That silence is the sound of a 47-page document becoming worthless. And that silence, more than any tariff or treaty or tweet, tells you everything you need to know about who is actually winning this war. The blueprint is ash. The counter strategy is alive, and Canada, the country they tried to break, is still standing.